Hi, I'm Professor Wegerif. I'm speaking to you from central Cambridge, where we've all been locked down in the UK at the moment. Thank you very much for inviting me to give a keynote at your conference. When I agreed to this idea, of course, I was planning to come over to China and to join you, and that would have been great. So I'm very sorry that I can't be there due to the pandemic. And all I can do is record this talk, which is very unsatisfactory in a way because I'd like to see your faces. I'd like to see your responses. I'd like to have questions. So I do hope I can visit later and perhaps you can share any responses to this with me by email. So as requested, I've prepared a talk on dialogic education for the internet age. And I'll just open up a PowerPoint now, which I hope will help you understand the ideas I'm going to put forward. Of course, this is the title of a book that I published in 2013, but I've been working in this area for some time. And one of the things I wanted to share with you is a new initiative at Cambridge, the Digital Education Futures Initiative. If you're interested, do get in touch. We're looking for support to create an institute where we can explore future models of education. And I've been working with a lot of people. I'll mention an interesting PhD study later, exploring and unpacking these ideas. So this builds on the ideas in a book from 2013 and hopefully takes it a little bit further. I will give you all the references at the end, but my main thesis is that what we think of as education is actually already very much shaped by education technology, particularly communications technology. So the current system, which is a coherent global system, is very much based on the affordances of print. You probably know that the first schools only occurred and emerged in ancient Sumeria, 3,000 years ago now, to teach writing. But that doesn't mean that education began 3,000 years ago. Education is really central to humanity, and all the oral societies that have been studied around the world and that continue to thrive have education systems in a way, but this is not based on learning to read and write, on print literacy, on reading books. It's based on being useful, participating, apprenticeship, joining communities of practice. And it's also based, which I find very interesting, on joining the culture as if it was a living dialogue. So that whereas on the whole in schools, you're transmitted knowledge from books, in oral societies, you tend to, through ceremonies, you put on masks, you possibly take drugs, you learn to speak with the voices of the ancestors as living voices. And I think this is a very exciting model of education because I'm arguing that in some ways that's a more universal model of education. And what we've got used to is just the last couple of hundred years. I mean, the current system only really began about 150 years ago and now spread globally, at least the mass education system based on print literacy with, paper-based exams and subjects that are all classified in different ways. It's fairly similar around the world. Of course, there are cultural differences, and I know China has some particularities, but from my experience, there's a remarkable similarity in what we mean by education these days in terms of education systems and the kind of standardized tests that measure learning. And this is all really based on the affordances of print literacy. And it contrasts very much with education as a bigger picture. And what I'm arguing now is that the internet has some affordances which mean that that traditional print-based model of education is no longer effective. In some ways, the internet offers new and exciting possibilities for education, which we're all using every day. I mean, we're all, I certainly am, at least. If I'm watching TV and I don't quite know what's going on, I'll just ask my phone a question, oh, what was this bit of history about, and so on, and I'll get answers. This is learning. It's extraordinary how the internet facilitates collaborative learning as well on different websites. We have Wikipedia. I think in China there are other alternatives where people collaborate to construct knowledge together. So the internet has extraordinary affordances for learning, but they don't seem to fit with the current education system. The internet is not used very much in schools, which is all largely based on the affordances of print. I'll explain just a little bit more. One of the differences I'm talking about is also a difference in ways of thinking, a difference in how we understand knowledge. On the whole, print has encouraged this idea of knowledge as representation, the idea that we know when we draw a model of reality and it represents that reality, and then we can store that model in a book, which are all carefully classified according to different subjects, and then we can transfer it into the brains of students. That's one model of education, of knowledge as some kind of thing. But we can only think of knowledge as a kind of thing because we have print literacy, because we have pictures and writing in books. Socrates was very unhappy about that. Socrates was an oral thinker. He didn't write. We know about Socrates because his student Plato wrote down his ideas. I get the impression that Confucius largely thought and taught through orally, and his ideas were written down. And you can see many traces of a very different kind of thinking in these writings from the past. And Socrates particularly accused writing of not being very good for developing intelligence. He said anyone can pretend to be clever if they read a script, but if you ask them a question, they don't know what they're talking about. He said real intelligence is dialogic. You have to be able to ask questions, answer questions. And he thought that writing was a moral failure. So he had a vision of knowledge not as representing truth, as storing lots of representations in your library, but as relationship, as knowing how to relate to particular people, particular contexts, and how to respond. This is actually quite similar. I've got a mask there from ancient China. In many oral societies, you have initiation ceremonies where you expand as a person, really. Your identity changed as you engage in dialogue with the cultural voices, the voices of the ancestors. And that's a relationship model of education. Why this is relevant to the internet age can be seen quite clearly if we just contrast a traditional model of knowledge, here represented by the Encyclopedia Britannica, which has of course gone out of print, but it still exists online, where you have experts who write the truth, and if you want to find out something, you go there, but there's no chance to question it or to change it. And there are many sites online, knowledge online, which requires peer-to-peer participation, where you can edit, you can question, you can get involved. I put up a Chinese Wikipedia version there, but you can see the model is different. And of course, there's a great deal of fear and doubt about this model, because the problem is anybody can write anything on the internet. So how do you know that it's true? That's an interesting educational challenge. It's a challenge to the critical thinking of students, their ability to triangulate. They need to check. But in that very checking, they're already participating in knowledge construction. So it's no longer possible just to be the passive consumer of knowledge. It isn't possible because the internet projects us all into a world of multiplicity and uncertainty. Whatever the topic, there are always going to be multiple voices, and you have to select between them. So this requires a new kind of education to be able to cope with this new situation. And I've just put this little diagram up there to show that it's structural. It's to do with the nature of truth, the nature of knowledge is to do with the communications technology. If you have talk, you have a very different situation. You have things are limited to a particular place and time. When print comes in, truths can be abstracted from their environment, from their context. They can be spread across the world in books carried by ships and so on. You can have a single law code that covers a whole country, but you can't really have a dialogue because that's not the nature of print. And that's what our education systems reflect. They have a central curriculum on the whole and in general. They have textbooks printed at the center and distributed. You have fixed exams. It's a one-to-many system. It's not a dialogic system. The internet, however, returns structurally to the kind of dialogic affordance of oral societies. This is a map of the internet, that strange brain-like looking structure. But it's constantly expanding and it has no boundary, which is the important thing. And of course, it contains within it, it continues the same affordances of print, of this transcendence of space and time. It's global, of course, but it also has the affordance of oracy, of being two-way, being dialogic, potentially dialogic. And that, all that means is that people don't only consume truth, they also produce it. That if you try to find almost anything, you'll find yourself in a dialogue where people are disagreeing or developing ideas. It's not a fixed one-to-many medium as print encyclopedias, for example, are. So this introduces, I've been talking about this interesting contrast between the monologic, which literally means in Greek single-voiced, and the dialogic, which literally means not double-voiced, as some people think, but reason through and across difference. Dia means space of difference, through and across. So you have, obviously, the monologic tends to be this idea, which is very common in science and mathematics, I find, that all these different perspectives can be reduced to a single true perspective. Whereas with dialogic, you have the understanding that any utterance at all, any meaning that people try to make, only makes sense in a context. It means something in relation to the previous utterances and to the future utterances in a dialogue. It's relational. It's all about, in fact, relationship. And there's always uncertainty. There's always multiplicity. But of course, this raises all sorts of problems about the nature of truth. And I think we are living in an interesting transitional period where we have these new tools, the internet, but we aren't using it very well. And there's been a concern, certainly in America recently, about what they call truth decay, about the fact that anybody can say anything on the internet and there's no control, and it's not being the truth is being obscured by fake news and all that sort of thing. But the problem is that there's never been a single truth. The idea of a reduction to a single truth, unfortunately, doesn't work, because traditional media have also put forward particular perspectives which need to be challenged. On the whole, science only progresses when there are multiple perspectives in play, and there have been some good studies of this. You only get creativity when you have to see things from more than one perspective. So by focusing on dialogue here, we're focusing on the idea not of a complete free-for-all, of complete fragmentation and cacophony of different voices that don't connect. The idea is more like polyphony in music, where you only have beautiful music because there are multiple voices, multiple instruments playing different strands of music, and they work together to create a meaning that is shared, that is not just a chaos of different clashing noises, but at the same time, it's not just a single repeated note, because that has no meaning at all. It's in the gap and distances between the notes that you hear the music. And the same is true with thinking, the same is true with dialogue. If there was complete unanimity, convergence on a single truth, there is no need for dialogue. You only get dialogue across difference. I have to try and explain to you my ideas. You should, I hope, be at least in your own minds responding, but your understanding is going to be shaped by your different experience from a different part of the world. And in that gap of difference, new meanings emerge, but without the difference, there's no dialogue and there's no meaning. So on the one side, if we reduce it to monologue, nothing happens. On the other side, if it's completely open, nothing happens. So we're looking for the happy medium, what we could call, I suggest, a kind of harmonious or at least constructive form of multiple conversational voices working together to construct meaning together. I just wanted to introduce here the fact that we have been experimenting with ways of teaching for dialogue for some years now, and we have some quite effective methods. This is a book on dialogic education I wrote with Neil Phillipson, where we show how it's only through dialogue that you can really address conceptual understanding, because to understand something is to see it from multiple perspectives, to be able to explain it to other people. This large handbook here is the first research handbook in the field of dialogic education, which we recently produced here at Cambridge. I'm co-director with Sarah Hennessy of the Cambridge Educational Dialogue Research Centre, and we've done a lot of work showing that dialogic education can work and has very good effects, not only on the new skills people want, like creativity, collaboration, communication, and critical thinking, but it also has very good effects in scores on standardized tests within the traditional curriculum. Because on the whole, dialogue can helps children learn anything effectively. Well, obviously, there's a problem in that when you engage them in dialogue and teaching through dialogue, things can take longer, so you can't always cover the massive amount of knowledge which some curriculum areas seem to want. But what you do get is more depth of understanding, which is surely what's important in education. So I'm just introducing here a very simple technique we developed some years ago called Thinking Together. And this is offering ground rules for talk to frame dialogue and induct children into effective dialogue in the classroom. This was done with quite young children in primary school, and we asked them to come up with their own ground rules. Of course, the teacher guided them a little, but here's an example of the sort of thing we mean. That when you give arguments, when you make claims, you should give reasons for those claims. When you're challenged, you shouldn't get defensive, but you should offer reasons. And you should ask other people what they think, and you should listen with respect, and you should work together as a group to take responsibility as a group for the decisions you make. We tested the effect of this using these simple nonverbal reasoning tests, which are often used in intelligence tests. But what we did was give the children just one pencil, and then we recorded them at the beginning. And then after our program of teaching over 3 months, we recorded them at the end so that we could get a quantitative score. Of course, it had control groups. It was a proper experiment. We got very good results, not only on their shared thinking, their ability as a group to improve their thinking, but also when we tested individuals, we showed that they apparently became more intelligent. They did better at this problem-solving tests on their own as an individual. Quite exciting result, which has been repeated many times in many countries. We've done very similar studies in China with similar results. This was conducted by my colleague Yang a few years ago. There's a publication which I can share with you if you ask, but also particularly Sarah Hennessy and Pete Dudley and other colleagues from the Cambridge Educational Dialogue Research Unit are working with teachers and PhD students in China on quite a number of dialogic education projects now, which are getting very good results, which is interesting because, of course, there is a bit of a cultural difference in Confucian education. There's less focus on talk, perhaps, than you get in the UK or in America. A lot of focus on individual reflection. But this actually is also part of the dialogue. The groups that did well in our experiments are groups that paused a lot, that had a shared focus on the problem. But there was a lot of individual thinking going on, stimulated by the group talk, and then returning to the group talk. So I think you'll find it works quite well in a Confucian education culture, as well as in a Western culture. One of the main differences we found can be summed up by these two little diagrams, that in the beginning, the children were thinking separately. They weren't really doing shared thinking. They were possibly competing to be the one that got the right answer, or they were thinking too quickly and just in their own space. But at the end, after our training program, we had this more collaborative thinking, shared thinking, which you could see, for instance, by the pregnant pauses, where everybody's looking at the problem, but there's a pause and then an answer emerges. Or when somebody asks for help, says, I don't understand, please explain. Or when somebody starts off saying one thing, but then listens to what the others are saying and changes their mind and comes around to seeing it in new ways. So there are lots of ways in which you can see this shared thinking. And it was this attitude of dialogic attitude, really, of shared thinking that characterized the successful groups. And this helps us to understand what dialogic education really is. It's education for dialogue. So that at the end of dialogic education, you become better at engaging in dialogue, at learning things with others, asking good questions, listening to the answers, not just listening to the words, but understanding the meaning. So it's also about better quality of relationship and social awareness and working together with other people. And that's what we're trying to teach through dialogic education. In successful dialogue, it's no longer separate people thinking and just sharing their ideas. There's a collective thinking. It's not me thinking or you thinking, but we're thinking together. And I've expressed that idea with this concept of dialogic space. So to enter into dialogue is to move from an individual space into a shared dialogic space where there are multiple perspectives in play. How does this address the challenge to the current education system and the issue of technology that I started with? One of the problems that people increasingly realize is that the proliferation of artificial intelligence is going to replace a lot of current jobs that people seem to be being prepared for by the education system, because all this rigorous thinking, all this knowledge can be done much more effectively by computers in many cases. What computers can't do is dialogue. They can't do the social and emotional, the relationship side. They can't do the creativity. They can't do real intelligence. By real intelligence, I mean general intelligence that can see things in a bigger context, that can look at things from multiple perspectives and create new perspectives. Artificial intelligence can just be trained to do specific tasks, but it does them very well. And that's leading to a crisis in education because there's a general recognition that we are not teaching for the right skills for the future and that we should be. This picture just illustrates the opposite of what I was saying about dialogic education. Dialogic education is education for dialogue, for effectively collaborating with other people. Still, in Cambridge and everywhere in the UK, we have these massive individual sit-down tests where with just a paper and a pencil where you're kind of supposed to show what you know. But this isn't a very good demonstration of your ability to collaborate or solve problems in teams, for example. So that challenge to the current education system has led to an interest in future skills, or what are sometimes called 21st century skills. But when you look at that literature, you'll see that a lot of these skills, which we really need to teach now for young people to succeed in the future, are precisely what you learn through engaging in dialogue. Critical thinking is essential to dialogue because in a dialogue you have to be able to hold together more than one perspective. And doing that means to compare and contrast those perspectives. Real critical thinking is always dialogic. It always involves engaging with an outside another point of view. Similarly, creativity, as I've explained earlier, emerges from the play of multiple voices. Collaboration is obviously central to dialogue, communication skills central again to dialogue. So a lot of these future skills are precisely what we're teaching by teaching dialogue. I mentioned earlier the concern that young people's engagement in social media, and I believe certainly in America and the UK, it's more than 7 hours a day that young people tend to spend on average on the internet. I know from recent studies in China, for most people, it's now an average of 5 hours a day. So pretty much around the world now, people are increasingly going online. And this is leading to concerns that brains are changing, that people are becoming more stupid, that they can't concentrate. The only place where you don't get much use of the internet is in schools, which is interesting because it has so much potential for education. So a PhD student, Athanasia Kotsio, is in her third year now. We haven't published this work yet, but she's got some quite exciting results looking at the impact of heavy social media use on education. One of the things she found was very much what everybody's saying, that of course they don't get as good results because of the distraction effect. They complained about all the notifications, that they couldn't concentrate, that they couldn't focus on their homework and all that sort of thing. And indeed, they got less good results in the standard school tests. But Athanasia also looked through qualitative interviews and through statistical study at the impact of heavy social media use, things like Facebook, with children quite young, 9 to 11 years old, as the impact that it had on other kinds of knowledge. And she found that they showed more dialogic thinking or dialogic open-mindedness, according to a measure that we had developed in other studies. And that showed that they were more aware of global issues, and they were better actually at deep understanding of complex issues. And of course, they showed more confidence and they were more talkative, and they had more friends, which is, in other words, there was a different model of education that was coming through the social media use. They might not have been very good at their exams and tests in the classroom, which was nothing to do with the internet, but they were actually still learning a great deal. They were learning a great deal about the world and about other people in this more relational way. I found that quite exciting because it implies that when we talk about education or learning, we should ask what kind of learning, what kind of education. And it could be that there's a traditional print-based model of education, which is now in conflict with an emerging and potential new internet-based model, which is more about learning these dialogic skills and learning how to engage with and relate to other perspectives around the world. But of course, it's not a choice between social media use or not. I don't think that's the right answer. One of the things Athanasia found in her study interviewing these young people was the very negative effect of notifications. Well, you can change that. You can switch off all the notifications. You don't have to be constantly distracted. In other words, there are ways in which we can design the social media that would make it work better for education. This is just one example from a project called Generation Global, where they have a lot of dialogues taking place between people from different cultures. And their website had features that I thought were quite interesting, that were designed to promote education. For a start, you had a very active moderation. If anybody was worried about any kind of post, it was immediately taken down. So you didn't have to wait for it to be taken down. I just thought this was quite interesting. You know, on Twitter, you only have to post a limited number of characters in many systems, but they also had a minimum as well as a maximum, so it doesn't get too long. They had a minimum, so people couldn't just respond to each other by saying, yeah, or thanks, or smiley face. They had to write at least 30 characters, so it was promoting dialogue. My point of mentioning this is that a lot of the problems with learning and education on the social media are because it's not really designed to support education. We could perhaps design something that does support education. A lot of the problems with fake news come from the algorithms which are designed to sell things. It's been designed not for the collective good, but for the capitalist need to advertise and sell products. And that's how social media sites tend to work, at least sites like Facebook and Twitter. I can't speak for all of them. So why don't we collectively, just as a thought in response to these issues in this talk, design a global social media platform that could be focused entirely on education, on young people and others joining together in communities to engage in shared challenge-based inquiry to solve local problems and global problems, and to learn through doing that, and to be also connected, of course, to the kind of resources that will help them learn concepts, what's called mastery-based learning. So if you're trying to solve a problem to do perhaps with nuclear power, you could do a course on nuclear power. If you're trying to understand global warming and work with others to see how we can solve it, you could do a course on understanding the climate. So it's not in contradiction to the traditional model of education, but it's taking it much further. It's taking it further to engage and induct children and young people into education as a continuous global dialogue where we design the future together and solve problems together. So this is one of the proposals that we're putting forward and looking for support and funding for as part of the new Digital Education Futures initiative at Cambridge that I mentioned. And the idea is that we could create a kind of education that develops the leadership that we need for the future and addresses global challenges. And as we think, dialogue is essential for also creating a sustainable future without the constant threat of warfare, where people can understand each other, as well as developing these key future skills that I mentioned: communication, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking. It's also developing the global understanding and capacity to collaborate that we're going to need to face the global challenges that are threatening the future of the planet. Challenges, of course, like global warming, but there are so many more. There's global terrorism, and there's the challenge to water supply, but there are also many local challenges. Wouldn't it be great if at the end of education, children weren't just prepared to get certificates, but they were developed such that they took an enterprising attitude to seeing what could be changed and improved and working together with others to change and improve it. That's not what the current education system is delivering. So we think we have a way of doing that. But of course, we need to research it. We need to explore it. This would be design-based research. We need to create a global platform, see what works, what doesn't, iteratively redesign it. And we think we could create a global network of learning, an open web of learning, which would be far more effective for the future. And that's a proposal that I hope you could perhaps join with us in developing. We're looking for support and we're looking for sponsors. So in a way, I was ending the talk there, not with a theoretical idea about how the internet requires dialogic education, but with a practical proposal for how we could quite easily transform education by creating a free access to a global platform of educational resources, but more particularly of peer-to-peer learning in shared inquiry groups where we can develop educational projects. And the first entry requirement would be the kind of teaching children how to engage in face-to-face dialogue and how to learn together in primary schools that we've already shown can be done very effectively. So if we combine that with the amazing affordances of this new technology, of the internet and of artificial intelligence and other forms of digital technology, we could really have an education system that promotes collective intelligence, planetary intelligence, so that the education system could be part of our global scientific endeavors to solve the challenges that face us, but also, of course, our more humanistic endeavors to understand each other and to understand the human condition and to go forward in a way which is sustainable and enables everybody to flourish and thrive and enjoy their lives. Whereas the current education system often seems to be closing people down into a sense of isolation and individualism. At least that's the feeling that I get. I think we could do much better with these new tools and with these new possibilities. So the main points I'm trying to make are that our current education system isn't fixed, can be changed. It's actually fairly recent, and it doesn't really serve the collective human interest. It serves interests of a particular now legacy technology, print literacy. That seems to be what it's all about. That's obviously we need to induct people into reading and writing and doing mathematics, but do we need to go much further than that to induct them into relationships with others across the planet and with an understanding of knowledge as joining a community of inquiry. a larger dialogue. And so we need a new kind of education that can build on the affordances and possibilities of the internet age. And this takes the form of lifelong collaborative learning, not only consuming knowledge, but also participating with others in producing knowledge. This is something that's essential, even in the micro level of being able to use the resources of the internet. You need to be able to construct knowledge. You need to be a producer as well as a consumer, a critical thinker. And I have tried to argue that dialogic education is the best way that we can address this challenge, is the best way that we can work with the internet to create an education system for the future. But of course, I don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. That's why we're researching it. And that's why we need more large design-based research projects to explore the potential and the impact of these new approaches to education. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it was interesting and I didn't go on too long. I put a few list of references here, and I do hope you can follow up with any feedback on the talk and let me know how the conference goes, and keep in touch, and maybe I'll see you in the flesh one day. Thanks very much. Bye.